Welcome to the CapLander Podcast, where we dive into the dynamic world of private capital markets. Whether you're new to private market investing or a seasoned professional, this podcast unpacks the latest trends, insights, and opportunities shaping the industry. Featuring expert guests and deep discussions, CapLander is your go-to resource for staying informed and inspired. Hi, Jody. Hi, Jenny.
Hi.
Hi, Morgan. Hi, Jenny. Very exciting today. We were just discussing that we have Jenny Felding. Are you in New York right now, Jenny?
I'm in New York City, where it has finally turned. I know last time we met, we were freezing cold in the city, but it's actually gorgeous in spring, so we're all happy here.
Kind of have to thank you because when we met you you were nice enough to meet us for lunch, and it was the first time we had met you, and you said specifically at that lunch, you all should do a podcast. And Morgan and I had been toying with the idea, so we decided, you know what, that's it. We are going to do it. And so we sort of roped you in because you had no choice because you were part of the original team that had inspired us. Thank you for being here.
I think two things. You guys, first of all, have such a great dynamic, and that makes for a great conversation. And then you produce such insightful and valuable content. It's great to just reach more audiences. So I'm excited that you took me up on it.
I would love for you to give a little bit of background on yourself, because then I have a couple of pressing questions or really overviews, because you are a founder, you are a lawyer, you are an investor, you are now an author. But I think first and foremost, which is why we all struck a chord, is you are also very close to your family. Much of your inspiration came from your grandparents, and I know from talking to you in New York that you live close to your mom and dad. And so there's a lot of similarities in this holistic approach, and the how you do anything is how you do everything. You have that everywhere mindset from Everywhere Ventures. So for those of us that are not as familiar with you, give us a little bit of an overview and context today.
Yeah, as you mentioned, grew up in New York City and actually live in, same couple blocks where I grew up, and many of my friends and family just live nearby. So small town girl in a big city in some ways. But I was really inspired by a trip I took with my grandmother when I was young, and it really opened my eyes to the world. And I think we can get very myopic in this country, especially in these times. But yeah, I recently wrote a book that really talks about this idea of global entrepreneurship and opportunities that are far from the glow of Silicon Valley. So yeah, I consider myself an accidental entrepreneur, an accidental investor, now an accidental author, but kind of all tied together by this idea that the world is this incredible place and that we all need to tap in and be inspired by the founders and the people, around the world building inspirational companies.
But you've even formalized it more so by calling this sort of the everywhere mindset. And I did hear you talk, Morgan and I were discussing this sort of your mantra about how you live and how you travel and how your relationships are and that global perspective. But there must be, and you tie this all to business at the end of the day, right?
Again, I think that growing up in places like New York or being in Silicon Valley, when we think about entrepreneurship, for a long time, capital has been constrained to certain locations, but I think we all believe that innovation's everywhere. And over the last couple of years, especially, we've been able to tap into innovation globally, right? I think the pandemic all of a sudden made us realize that we could invest in companies elsewhere, that we can really be inspired by entrepreneurs globally. So I tie it into business, but it definitely stems from just an innate feeling I have about the world and everything that we can learn from others. It is interesting because right now, as we know, the U.S. is taking a look internal, almost isolationist approach. And I think it's a great time and a really good way to distinguish yourself by thinking globally, even during these times.
We've had that a lot because our data set is global, and we see that with a lot of talent, especially on the executive side. There's really no difference or nominal differences in region, whether you have a CEO in Europe, United Kingdom, Boston, San Francisco, because top talent is top talent really regardless of where you are. So we've definitely have seen that on the compensation side. But to tie it back a little bit to Everywhere Ventures, you are an early stage investor where you have I think from I saw on your LinkedIn at least says that you've been the first money into hundreds of extremely successful companies. What was your intention, or why did you want to be an early stage investor versus somebody who could maybe play it a little bit more safe and put money in later down the road once a company maybe had more proof of concept or showed more signs of being successful?
Yeah. So in 2007, I started my first company in New York City, which it's hard for many listeners to believe because this is the second largest tech ecosystem. But this place was not a great place to run a startup. But I kind of looked around and I thought, well, we don't have what Silicon Valley has, but we have a lot of the raw material, right? We've got great talent, as you just mentioned. We have incredible engineering schools with lots of amazing people coming out of that. We have all the multinationals here. And we have capital. We just don't have venture capital, right? So there was a lot of money in New York, whether it was real estate or Wall Street. And so I kind of dug my heels in and decided I was going to run a company here. And fast forward 15 years, and we've just seen the ecosystem develop. But when I ran my first company, there just weren't a lot of resources. I don't even think the term mentor was really applied within the
You mean
context of
resources like from the investors, or in addition, outside of you being the entrepreneur and having your engineering team, there weren't resources to foster you as an entrepreneur?
Yeah. And I think because of that, I made a lot of mistakes. There wasn't that first generation of entrepreneurs helping the next generation. And you just see that now. And I really believe in peer learning and in mentorship and just in support that you can get from other people that have been there. So I made a lot of mistakes. And I think after my second company, I looked within and said, you know what? I want to be part of the solution here. And what can I do? And I spent almost 8 years at an accelerator called Techstars in New York, running the New York program. And that is, as we know, there's capital involved, but there's so much more, right? There's resources, there's content, there's this community that's being built. And I became just a real believer that startups, especially at the earliest stage of their journey, they just need a lot more than
It's
just
the worst mistake you made.
the worst mistake I made was in my organizational hiring, I guess. I felt that the buck stopped with me, and I was very nervous to hire people and empower them. So I think that's pretty common of first-time founders. They are the bottleneck and they just have a grip on everything. And at some point we reached almost 100 people in the company. You can't
And that was causing real problems.
yeah. And I just didn't have the support of people who could say, like, here's how an effective and functional organization works. Here's how you hire great people and you let them do what they do best.
Yeah. The worst mistake I ever made, I was in a board meeting and I basically told the investors my opinion. Like I strongly said, here's almost what you should be doing. And then there was this like mic drop moment where there was not a word in the board meeting. And I thought, okay, I'm never going to do this again. And I think, Morgan, the worst thing you've ever done is leave a meeting and trying to leave when
No, it was a conference. It was a conference, and I walked out. I went to leave early, like maybe before the session was done, and I body slammed the glass door. And I was one of the only women there. And I was wearing a white blazer, and I was probably like 6 months into working for the company, so I was just getting my sea legs, and I was like, I'm done. I'm
I
done.
laughed so hard. And I told my mother the story and is she okay? And I didn't even think to ask. I just was
I
dying
don't
with
know.
laughter.
Oh my gosh, that's a great story. I'm not sure if mentorship could have helped you, Morgan, but definitely,
No, I don't think so.
Jody, that's a very similar experience that I had. Just there wasn't, again, people with expertise that really had your best interest at heart, right? They really were that give first mentality where they just want to see you succeed, not that they have an iron in the fire or an agenda for you. As I transitioned actually thought I was going to start my next company, but as I ended up becoming an investor, I really said, I want to spend the next decade or two of my career supporting founders at the earliest stage of their journey, because that's where they need it, and figuring out mechanisms on how to do that that's beyond cash, right? So building kind of community and networks. Yeah. And so that's how I got into it. And I can honestly tell you, I really enjoyed running startups, although they're really hard. But I do feel that I have found my superpower, and I just wake up every day so grateful I get to do this work.
One of the things, and continuing on the mentorship trend, is that you're very vocal on LinkedIn. And I think you have one of the probably prestige top voice accreditations. And so I think even from last week, you have people who really comment and respond and engage with you. And I think it is really true to part of you being available and a mentor and reachable is the fact that you're asking questions and people are engaging back with you. And it's, I would imagine, has been something that's been made you a better mentor in a lot of ways because you're hearing from so many people, whether they're in your portfolio or not in your portfolio.
Yeah, I think if I could describe my personal brand, it would really be about authenticity. And I
Right.
think in this industry, what we've seen is a lot of posturing and a lot of things that maybe have led to bad outcomes, right? Or we read TechCrunch and we read all these success stories, but we don't
Right.
hear the real voices of how hard it is, what the day-to-day struggles are for founders or for fund managers or for people that are just in the industry. And
You
so
talked about that you've seen both. I was reading something that you had said that it's just as exciting to see a company be really successful as you've also seen people who or founders have not been successful.
yeah, 100%. In fact, we have backed founders in our fund one that have not been successful, and we think they're incredible humans. And obviously, product market fit doesn't always come, and we'll back them again.
I
So,
think it's
um,
harder now. You're still deploying capital, but the emerging funds, I know you've had commentary on this. And of course, we know that emerging funds are having hard first time manager to raise capital. And do you think it's different now, be like whether you're in New York or Silicon Valley, or is still that long game, big picture, and regardless that the investment firms will carry on?
yeah, let's talk about that authenticity. I was like one of the brave people who talked to the Wall Street Journal last week and said we've deferred our fundraise until the fall because we think that this environment is very unstable. And we've seen many IPOs being taken off the table, and many fund managers like us really had to rethink. Now, we raise money primarily from other founders, right? Founders and operators. And if they've seen their portfolios decline 30, 40%, it's very hard to go back to them and say, hey, we're raising our next fund. I think I like to just put that content out there about actually what's happening, not, all the great fundraisers that you're hearing about. To answer your question, I think it is very hard for most managers, established and emerging right now, because there's just not a lot of liquidity in the system. And I think
And there hasn't been and doesn't seem to be any clear path right now sort of forward.
yeah, and I think whatever your political leanings were, as the new administration came in 2025, there was a lot of hope that, again, M&A market would really take off and that the IPOs would really start to happen with the tariffs and the turmoil that's happening right now. That's probably not going to happen in 2025. And so, again, if you think about the capital stack, it's just all clogged up, right? So the LPs aren't getting money back to give to the GPs, and then the GPs can't invest in startups. So the whole
Right.
stack is really
Talk about a bottleneck.
jammed up. Yeah.
But if you
So
think it other ways, isn't there some component to this so that that it's taking longer, right? We see this, that the vesting times for carried interest inside of the firms are taking longer, and that it is that companies, we always knew this with life science companies, you've been more in the tech, and now I know AI and other more innovative, but has your mindset switched anyhow, regardless of this, that it's taking longer than the back in the dot-com days, or think it's this infrastructure that you're talking about, like mentoring and giving companies resources, is that just contributing to having fewer companies, but they're stronger?
well, I think what's interesting is if you think about fund size. So if you're a multi-billion-dollar fund, you really need those decacorns because you've got a lot of money that you need to return to your LPs. What's interesting about being a small fund manager is that we have off-ramps to return capital. And so one of the bright spots, I guess, within the last couple of years has been the secondaries market. And so we are seeing, we were able to return our 2018 fund based on one acquisition and one secondary that we did and part of our position. So I think that coming back to your question, like if you're disciplined and your fund model works, you can be successful in different environments. And I think that's really important because the environments are going to change.
So a lot of the things are in your book, each chapter is on different places, which I just from reading through it at a high level, is there looking at entrepreneurs in different places? Has there been, you obviously have traits that have stood out across all of them, but for somebody who is thinking about ordering your book and reading it, is there anything high level that you could tell somebody about what those common traits would be or what really stands out to you when you're talking to a founder and considering investing in their company?
This is
Yeah, I
more
think
critical now than ever. You were so preemptive. You had optics on this from the beginning. So right now you're really at a leadership role, a mentorship role for the industry, not just with inside of your
right.
own venture fund.
Yeah, and I think what I just mentioned in terms of you have to be agile is one of the big themes in my book. I call it elasticity. Some people call it resilience. But I think that trait within founders, within fund managers, within people in general is so important right now. We see the market is changing so fast. We don't know what's going to happen to Bitcoin, what's going to happen to our treasuries. And so you just have to be someone that's always thinking ahead, that can be elastic and responsive to what gets thrown at you. So I'd say that's one of the attributes that I have just seen over and over in my last decade of investing. As I travel around the world, I really have met founders. Many of them come from small towns in rural places or war-torn countries, and just the resilience and elasticity that they've shown throughout their life, and then obviously been able to parlay that into successful companies, is something that I think we all need to cultivate, especially if we're sitting here in the United States, where relative things have been pretty good for many of us.
Right. It's still been good if you look over the history of the past decade or 2 decades in general. We're still the United States of America that way, but having the global perspective is really very helpful. And you take it one step further, which ties in to so much of sort of the Thelander mantra as well, which I know, which is where we clicked. We had that. I think about it when you date. If you're dating someone and you get that ick, you're like, ugh, no. If you get the ick, you can't do it. But if you get that, yeah, there's a shared something, and this person has that same kind of spark around. You use so many great words when we had talked to you, like about the scaffolding, and you're so knowledgeable, like you're almost in a league of your own this way, whether you know it or not. And it's very intoxicating because it makes people around you want to do better. And with all of that, though, it sounds like you were very early influenced. And I know this resonates with Morgan and me because we've
Oh,
had this generational support as well. You've
I
had
love
some really,
Oh
yeah,
yeah, I
great
was gonna
people,
say
your grandparents, your grandfather, Morgan's grandfather has been very formidable in our lives. So share a little
not
bit about that with
oh,
us.
not even just a grandfather. Like you wrote about both of your grandparents and two in such a nice way because I'm very lucky in the sense that I also know both of my grandparents. And my grandfather has been instrumental with me. And also talking about a mentor, he has been the biggest mentor for me on a professional sense because he is also an entrepreneur. And you said your grandmother was pretty much one of a kind, as is mine, in all the best
Yeah.
ways possible. And I think my mother follows her pretty closely where they broke the mold after both of them.
One of the things that's interesting is now, because we all work in tech, we associate entrepreneurship with tech, or some of us do. But the truth is, this country was really built with a different type of entrepreneurs, small business owners, right? So my grandfather owned fruit stores in Brooklyn. My other grandfather, he was an accountant, but when he couldn't get a job at one of the big four, he basically hung his shingle and worked from the basement of his house in Brooklyn. And I think that tenacity and that kind of drive, I saw it growing up firsthand, and I just saw that that can really build incredible companies, incredible skills, and I took that to heart. Now it's funny because I started my career very traditional. I went to law school, I worked at JP Morgan, but I think in my heart of hearts, I always
You
fancied
knew.
myself an entrepreneur. I think it's something that gets cultivated. I don't know if you're born with it or you figure it out, but you definitely gets cultivated by your surroundings. And my family was very encouraging of everything that I did. And so when I
Yeah,
did a
you said
crazy
that because
thing,
it could have been so different where you were raised to being basically you go to high school, you go to college, you can go to law school, but you get married, you have kids. And you said that your grandfather was very formidable in that being independent and having your own mindset and financial independence was very important.
exactly. Both my parents worked for themselves as well. And so I think the model was really about controlling your own destiny. And we say that to entrepreneurs now all the time, whether it's around not taking too much capital or understanding your balance sheet or your numbers. It's always about controlling your own destiny. So when I started my first company, I was working full time at JP Morgan, and I worked on this nights and weekends. And my team literally worked in my living room while I was at JP Morgan. And at some point we launched, we had customers, and everyone said, I think you better quit your job because this could be a thing. But the truth is, and I bootstrapped my venture fund as well. I think that my model was always like, and you guys too, you run a business, you're not taking seeking investment from other people. And I think the model for me was like, make sure you're self-sufficient, make sure that your business model works. And I know, Jody, at lunch, you told me about getting your business off the ground and, that the challenges that you had working and getting it started. And that really resonates with me because that's been my journey as well.
Yeah, you have your words. I always like the hustle style grit. We used to wear t-shirts. We all have them now. It's a Thelander thing that say hustle on them. And pretty much when I go to see my daughter or I go to Morgan or when I go stay with my son or when my partner's over, and always everyone wears these hustle t-shirts. And I think it's a mindset, right?
You're forgetting the one that you
100%.
used to sleep in for years, which was don't let fear stop you. It was like walking in and out
Yeah,
of
we
the
switch around. We've moved from we're not scared anymore to we know we've done it long enough and we see like a true entrepreneur that, okay, we may have to pivot and we may have to have some moments that may be more challenging than others, but innovation is always paramount. We have a steady place in this global economy. And while we may not grow in one area, that mindset of staying the course and doing well and being innovative is always going to be, there's always a place for that.
100%. But I love your story and it maps a little bit to mine. You don't necessarily have to be the 22-year-old out of college just throwing it all away and starting. A lot of us bootstrap our businesses, right? So I worked, nights and weekends on my company until it was viable. And then I worked full time. And I think that's a message that we don't hear as much in Silicon Valley and in the tech ecosystem. Everything is like all or nothing. And, I believe that entrepreneurship starts in many, sometimes small ways. And so I really encourage people to cultivate it and like maybe your side hustle will become your full-time hustle.
I was going to say, just to add on to it, people come up with ideas in the craziest ways. It's like listening to other podcasts. I always love how the founder of Ring started, is that he was an engineer and he was in his garage and his doorbell rang and he was like, I wish I could see who was at my door without leaving my garage. And it's something that's such a simple idea, but look, Ring was acquired by Amazon, extremely successful company. And it just shows you there really is not one way and there's no timeline or deadline to say you have to do this by this age. Otherwise, you're never going to be able to start your own company or be successful.
I want to know what time you get up in the morning because in the precursor to the book, it talks about that your grandfather got up at 4 a.m. And I had to laugh because I just read in the Wall Street Journal today an article about all these CEOs who are getting up at 4:50 something and they have these whole protocols routine around. That's the only time that they can get their work done until they can take care of themselves until they have to take care of everybody else. Now me, I'm a good like 8:30, 9 o'clock. At 4 a.m. or anything like that would just kill me. So
Something's wrong. If Jody's up at 4 o'clock in the morning because the fire alarm's going off and she's being evacuated. That's it.
What's your morning like?
I think my self-starting self really happened young. So I am just a natural morning person. And so I would get up as like a 6-year-old at 5:30 and my parents taught me how to go into the kitchen and put the bagel in and the bagel bit in the toaster. And I was like the 6-year-old who was very self-sufficient. I was an only child as well. But yes, I benefit from being a natural early riser.
You can tell. And Morgan, you're somewhere in between, but you could tell Jenny was one of those A+ game people who has that early to rise. I have to aspire to this. That's my parting shot here. I'm going to try and work harder at this.
I am a 7 a.m.er. Like 7 a.m., I feel good to go. My alarm goes up at 7. I can be in a workout class by 7:30 and I can be at my desk by 8:45, which for me is like absolutely perfect. So
I love it. I love it. Just don't have me do anything too important after 6 o'clock.
Yeah, we got to get moving. All right, Jenny, it was so great to catch up with you. And we look forward to seeing you more everywhere and sharing your everywhere mindset. And I personally have been left with the takeaway that I'm going to try and get up earlier and earlier every morning.
I love it. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, thank you.
For, inspiration.